Protests in Moscow continue for the 8th straight weekend. Is President Vladimir Putin's control over Russia slipping? I'm Femi Okay.
And I'm Malika Bilal. You're in the stream. Whether you are in Russia or outside, join us via Twitter or our live chat on YouTube.
Thousands of Russians in Moscow have taken to the streets this summer, demanding a fair democratic process during Sunday's city council elections. Protests began in July after 30 opposition candidates were disqualified from running. The council itself holds little power, but a rival victory could look bad for Putin's United Russia party.
After police cracked down on demonstrators and arrested thousands, more people began attending the events out of solidarity. The protests are now considered some of the biggest Moscow has seen since Putin returned to the presidency in 2012. Meanwhile, viral footage of police abuse, including of a student being punched in the stomach, is fueling public outrage.
The demonstrations come at a critical time for Russia as its economy is hurting from sanctions and low oil prices. But Putin, whose popularity is sinking, has warned protesters that law and order will be maintained. So, who will blink first?
Well, joining us to discuss is Vitaly Milanov in St. Petersburg, Russia. Vitaly is a member of the Federal Assembly of Russia.
Also with us, Roman Dobrokhatov. Roman is an activist turned journalist for Russian publication The Insider. He's based in Moscow but is currently in Kiev, Ukraine.
Finally, we have Yana Gorokhovskaya, a researcher at Columbia University. Yana is Russian-Canadian and specializes in Russian politics.
Hello, guests. Welcome. It's good to have you. Roman, I have to ask you, Moscow municipal local elections, it doesn't seem to be that big a deal. Why have there been protest after protest, arrests, violence? This is for a city council. Why would there be such an uproar over the last few months? Go ahead, Roman, tell us.
Well, that's a really very interesting question, because if we just imagine that Moscow authorities would let oppositional candidates to participate, well, I think 5 or 6, maybe 10 candidates would be in Moscow parliament, which is still a minority. So I don't think that it would really influence Russian politics. So there were no real risk for the government. But it's just a rule for the government. So they just can't let oppositioners, real oppositioners, I mean those who can criticize Putin, criticize the regime, they just can't let them participate because it would legitimize their slogans, legitimize opposition. So I think that's just biological reflex not to let these people participate. And that's why so many people felt that they are deceived. And I think for most of us, these elections are not important themselves. So it's just one of the reasons to go to the street and protest against the authoritarian regime itself, not just because of electoral fraud, but because our constitution is violated everywhere, in freedom of the press, in freedom of assembly. As you already mentioned, more than 1,000 of people were arrested during the protest. So it's about all the constitutional rights.
Right. Those constitutional rights are being at the heart of it. I understand from you, but I think there is still some confusion online among some people about what protesters' demands actually are. It's represented in this tweet from Margaret, who asked just that. She says, what are they asking for? I haven't seen one article that explains it. So we have a video commenter who tries to do just that. This is Sofia Orlowski. She's the senior program manager for Europe and Eurasia at Freedom House here in the U.S. And here's her take on what these protests are about.
I think what we're seeing at the core of these protests is a reaction of indignation. Thousands of people are being blatantly told that the opposition candidates that they want to see on the ballot for the Moscow City Legislature are not allowed to run and therefore potentially represent these citizens. So what's coming up next is the election day is this Sunday, September 8th. It's going to be a true test for the electoral system ahead of bigger elections for the parliament in 2021 and for the president in 2024.
So Yana, she explains it pretty clearly there, but can you give us the backstory to why some of these candidates wouldn't be allowed to run?
Right. Yeah. So the issue kind of began earlier in the summer when a group of oppositionists tried to register to be candidates for this election. And as part of that registration, they're obligated to collect nomination signatures because they're running as independents and not on behalf of a political party. So they need to collect the signatures of about 3% of residents in their districts, which is about, depending on the districts, between 5,000 and 6,000 people. And they managed to do that, and they handed in those signatures to the electoral commissions in their districts, along with all the other paperwork. And the commissions turned around and basically found fault with signatures, either saying that they just were fake signatures, they had handwriting experts deem them to be fake signatures, or they said that these people don't exist. That these were dead souls, these were dead people, they weren't residents. And so they denied all the independent opposition candidates in their registration. And that caused a great deal of outrage from supporters of these oppositionists, some of whom resorted to recording comments they posted on Twitter that said, you know, I'm so-and-so and I signed on behalf of this candidate and here's my signature. I'm very much alive. I'm very much a resident. And so that brought more attention to this election. As Raman said, people, you know, in general aren't very interested in regional elections. This election traditionally has about 20% turnout, so it's not a really important contest. But this knee-jerk reaction to disallow all independent candidates, all potential oppositionists from participation really got people kind of angry and involved.
Roman, I'm sure you know, either you know her personally or you know of Lyubov Sobol, and she was taken off the list of people who were able to actually be in contention for these local Moscow elections. And she has been very vocal on Twitter, on YouTube, talking about her challenges. She's been arrested many times. She's been trying to go to the protests. And at one point, this takes us back a couple of weeks into August, she is doing a recording. And then I'm going to show you what happens. I don't want to spoil what happens next. So she is online.
Сейчас ворвутся. Я не боюсь, сдаваться не собираюсь. Прошу обеспечить мне моего адвоката и буду дальше продолжать вести свою политическую деятельность. На каком основании? На каком основании?
Поставьте, пожалуйста.
Roman, what do you make of the way that the police and the authorities are dealing with the protesters and some of, I wouldn't say necessarily leaders, but some of the most prominent independent politicians who are not allowed to compete for the elections this coming Sunday?
Well, I think to better understand it, we should compare it with the previous situations when we faced the same refusal for independent candidates to participate. For example, 10 years ago, myself, I also tried to participate in Moscow elections. And also they say that all the signatures I gathered were falsified and that I'm not allowed, etc., etc. But we didn't see such kind of police violence. We didn't see such a big protest. I think what changed is that now we have very different environment. We have that we have hundreds of thousands of people who are ready to go to streets. We see that also Putin's approval rating fell down to around 30%, though it used to be around 60%. So it's another environment where the government feels frightened. And that's why they are so emotionally reacting to anybody who is trying to bring people to streets, because they understand that it can be dangerous now. Lyubov Sobol was one of the candidates. Well, she is very close to Alexei Navalny, one of the leaders of the protest. So that's why the government really feels threat, because they know how it ended in Ukraine, Armenia, Georgia, and other countries when people who went to the streets after electoral fraud, they just overthrown authoritarian regimes.
You mentioned that the government seems like they are afraid of these, and this is what Mohammed replies on Twitter. He says Russian authorities are now blaming Western meddling, which has ultimately caused unrest in Moscow. But so far, the protests are seen much larger than what they have been in a few years. Vitaly, I want to bring you in here on that point, the fact that these are such large protests and much larger than they have been in many, many years. What do you think the reason is?
Well, I'm quite wonder where have you found the big protests in Russia right now? Okay, we have the regular active
movements made by so-called opposition, but you have mentioned some unknown politicians, young politicians. Actually, a lady called Sobol. She has managed to collect signatures from the dead man to put her on the list, and because of that, she was unable to participate. But we had a bunch of opposition candidates right now in Moscow trying to achieve some votes. Unfortunately, it's hard to to discuss these questions with those who are not in Russia right now. Some of them are living permanently in the West. Some of them are fugitives in some aggression totalitarian states like Ukraine. But frankly speaking, I don't see the point, for the discussion. There's a huge number of opposition guys trying to attract the hearts of Moscow citizens, but all in vain because they are useless. They cannot offer any interesting agenda for the people. That's why they are not in need. And I think that this is, actually staged by Sobol and her friends.
So Vitaly, we appreciate you taking part in a discussion that you don't see any point of, but maybe Roman, perhaps you can help Vitaly appreciate the people in Russia who do believe that there is a point to this discussion.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would try to respond on several sentences. First, he said that he does not understand why this topic is discussed by the people who are not around this protest. So I participated in all the protests, and Mr. Milonov lives in another city, so he possibly that's why he doesn't understand who is he speaking about. Well, I know personally all the people who were arrested, and I know that they have no signatures of dead men, as he said, and even the government is not saying that Lyubov Sobol got some signatures from dead men. It's only Milonov's theory. So answering your question, so why it is different right now? Why so many people going to the streets right now? And it's really, you are right, this is the biggest protest since 2011, because there were around 60,000 people on Sakharov Square. So I think it's the sign that all the mood of the people is changing. It's not only about Moscow. We see the same in other regions, such as Arkhangelsk or Moscow region, or even in faraway cities in Ural, in North Caucasus. We see a lot of different regional protests for very, very different reasons. So I think it's just situation is changing. Something in the air is changing, and the Moscow elections is just one of the reasons why people are gathering together.
So point and counterpoint. I hear you saying that something in the air is changing. It sounds like there's a little bit of hope in your voice, but I want not to diminish that hope, but I want to share a comment from someone who thinks the opposite. So this is Eric Burakovsky. He's the assistant director for Russia and Eurasia program at the Fletcher School, Tufts University. And here's his idea.
The recent protests in Russia have been touted as some kind of turning point in Russian domestic politics by many experts, but there's little indication, at least not yet, that any real changes are coming. The protesters, while growing in number, are still no match for the government. The authorities remain unwavering and have responded with mass detentions and propaganda. According to the Levada Analytical Center, Putin's approval rating has sunk to as low as 64% this year, and approval for the government has dropped to around 39%. But the Kremlin has faced similar public sentiment back in 2013 and 2005. There is little reason to believe that 2019 will be a watershed moment for the system.
So, Yana, I actually want to bring you back in here on that point, because he says these protests might be significant, but nothing's going to change.
Yeah, so I first, just going back to the previous discussion, I just want to say that, it's been an old sort of go-to line from the regime to say that all the opposition can do is go out and scream in the streets. And of course, ironically, when they actually participate in the political process, when they try to be candidates, when they try to run for office, they're disqualified for ridiculous reasons. And it doesn't even mean that they would win a majority of these seats. It means that they have some level of support. Navalny got 27% of the vote in the mayoral election in Moscow in 2013. So there is some level of electoral support for the opposition in Moscow. I think in terms of the protests, we're conflating too much here. Protests don't mean regime change. Protests don't mean immediate political kind of radical change, but they are important. This is, again, a very low-level, kind of not very interesting election. Traditionally, it has been a not a very interesting election. To have between 50 and 60,000 people come out in early August and protest and show their support. Among the people who showed up were a lot of famous rappers, musicians, bloggers, artists, actresses who were supporting this movement. And the protest then had this dual message: Отпускай, допускай. So it was both in support of the independent candidates, but it was also in support of the people who had been detained and who had been violently detained in the protests before that. And people had an emotional reaction to this detention and kind of violence used against people who came out to demand something that's very elementary, just to demand to have the right to candidates, all kinds of candidates appear on the ballot.
I have to say that you may have caught it just a little bit earlier. We had a problem with a connection with Vitaly, so unfortunately we're not able to bring him back into this conversation. We will keep trying because his voice is very important, but I feel that we have lost him. But what is really important is to get the perspective from President Putin. In August, he was in France and he was asked by the international press about the protests in Moscow, and this was his response.
Citizens have a right to peaceful demonstrations according to the law, and authorities should ensure the realization of these rights. But no one, not the authorities or any group of citizens, has the right to violate existing laws. Bringing the situation to an absurd level or to clashes with authorities is a violation of the law, and those who are guilty of these violations should be held responsible.
Roman, so that was your president talking about the violence and the violence in the protest, but he wasn't really talking about the idea behind them and the push for independent candidates to be able to actually stand. Are you hearing more from your president about the bigger reason behind the protests?
Well, first of all, I would like to absolutely agree with the President Putin that those people who are responsible for the violence should be brought to justice. And now we understand who these people are very well, because during the latest protest, which happened several days ago, we saw also like a dozen of thousand people marching through the city, but this time there was no police around for some reason. No one understands why, but this time there were no police and it went absolutely peaceful. There were no arrests, no clashes, no one broken window. So now we understand what makes changes. So as soon as police appears in the city, as soon as they start arrests, we see clashes, we see a lot of unrest in the city and a lot of problems. So police and Vladimir Putin are those people who are responsible for violence, and I think that they should be brought to justice. And answering your question about like bigger reason, I think that actually Vladimir Putin understands it very well. He just doesn't want to mention it. But the bigger reason, I think one of the biggest reasons of these changes is like generational change, because young people, they don't watch TV at all. Not just because of propaganda, but just because they don't use it, because it's outdated. So they consume information differently. They are not victims of propaganda. And that's why it's very difficult for Vladimir Putin and Kremlin to impose their usual rhetoric and to make these people believe that our country is like a democratic country which is progressing very quickly and so on. So because of this generational changing, we see more and more people involving in these protests. And on the streets, you showed already pictures, and you can easily see that most of these people are like between 17 and 25. So it's very, very young people. I would say like 70% of these people are students or even like studying in college somewhere. And it's very difficult for the government to stop this trend.
I hear what you're saying there. I want to bring this in from Yasha on Twitter, Yasha Levine, who has an interesting thread that he says that we can share on the stream for our audiences. Yasha writes, the story that you won't read in the press is this. There's almost no real ideological or political difference between Putin's neoliberal clan of oligarchs, bureaucrats, and security goons, and the liberal opposition that's now protesting against Putin's rule, like Alexei Navalny and his people. He goes on to say that I talked to all sorts of people from the center of Moscow, from 17 to 70-year-olds, and few have any real faith that the liberal opposition to Putin will be any less corrupt or trustworthy than the current government if they come to power. So Yana, I will give this one to you. What do you make of this perspective that people don't actually think that there's any real difference?
Well, I'm not sure that I buy into this anecdotal talking to the people on the streets. First of all, the opposition in Russia, in so much as it's united in its pursuit of trying to participate in politics in Russia, to add plurality to politics, to make elections fair, to be able to compete in elections, to have less fraud in elections. Those are their overarching goals. Then they have different goals. They have different political beliefs. They have different political platforms. I think all of that kind of gets swept away because they're just excluded from the political arena. I think obviously internally, like in other places, internally the opposition has its differences. Some people are supportive of sort of a nationalist agenda. Some people are not supportive of a nationalist agenda. Some have various kind of different opinions on economic programs. I think that's all natural. That should exist in a democratic country.
Roman, I've just been looking at Yana's Twitter feed, and we're looking at what's been happening to protesters who've been jailed or arrested. So have a look here on my laptop. I'm just curious as to what is happening to the protesters who have gone to jail. So we've got one protester, surprise release. And then looking at others, this is from Medusa in English, that gives you Russian news in the English language. And there have been a day of verdicts in Moscow's cases against opposition demonstrators. And there's a mixed bag for Russia's opposition. Where do you think this protest might go next? The elections are on Sunday. Will they just stop once the elections have happened?
We see something that we already saw several years ago, I would say in 2012, after we also have this big rise of demonstration. And after that, we have a lot of criminal investigations against actually random oppositioners. So those people who were arrested were not the leaders of opposition mostly, but just the random people who were arrested for something that wasn't even a violation of the law. Like this time, also among these 9 people who are still in prison are those who just throw a paper cup in a policeman, or someone who just touched a helmet of a policeman. He even didn't hit it, he just touched it. And that was enough to put him in jail, and now he can be in prison for 5 years. So this is how the system reacts. They want to make a very clear signal to everybody that absolutely random person, so any one of you can be arrested and in prison for 6 years without doing anything wrong, without any violation of the law.
Okay.
But everybody should be afraid. So that's how they want to stop it, just putting some random people in prison.
So Roman, Yana, thank you so much. And Vitaly, for the brief time we had you, thank you very much as well. Malika, where do you want to leave us?
With this from Mohammed, who says the Russian Federation cannot meet the demands. The state has suppressed mass uprisings before that too, but I'm hopeful for constructive dialogue. So let's see.
The Moscow municipal elections take place on Sunday. Be sure to follow aljazeera.com for the latest. Thanks for watching. See you next time.